The night air was sharp and cold, echoing with the pounding of boots and cruel laughter. Sarah Miller burst from a jagged crevice in the rock, clutching a tattered leather notebook tight against her chest, as if it were her last piece of life. Her dress was torn, her breath ragged, and behind her the voices grew louder. Sheriff Wade Carver and his men, drunk on the hunt. The gravel of the trail bit into her bare feet as she stumbled forward. Then, through the silver wash of moonlight, she saw him. A lone rider, a shadow on horseback moving steady down the trail. The sight made her cry out, half in fear, half in desperate hope. The rider pulled up, his dark coat catching the light. He was tall in the saddle, silent, his gaze steady as he looked at the girl scrambling toward him. Sarah's knees buckled when she reached him. Tears streaked her dirt-stained face as she choked out words that trembled with horror. "He killed his deputy," her voice cracked. "And they're coming for me." Dust Creek lay on the edge of nowhere. A cluster of sun-bleached shacks, a saloon with a sagging porch, a church whose bell had long since cracked, and a main street that turned to mud every time the rain came down from the hills. Folks called it a town, but it was more like a scar left behind by the gold rush. The only thing that held it together was Sheriff Wade Carver's heavy hand, and the silence of men too tired to resist. Just beyond its borders, at the edge of the sagebrush flats where the land fell into ravines, Jonah Briggs lived alone. His cabin had once been part of a line camp for cattlemen, but the roof had rotted and the walls leaned like a drunk. Jonah spent his days repairing it, plank by plank, as though by fixing the house he might also stitch together the hollow pieces of his life. He was not an old man, not yet, 40, maybe a little more, but the years of war and loss had etched his face with lines deeper than age. His beard was iron gray, his eyes a restless steel. He had fought for the Union once, back when he was young and reckless, before he knew how little glory there was in killing. The war had taken his friends, and fever after the war had taken his wife and infant son. That was the end of Jonah Briggs the man. What was left behind was a shadow who needed no one and wanted nothing. He seldom came into Dust Creek. When he did, it was only to buy flour, coffee, or cartridges. People spoke his name in whispers. Some said he was a gunman, others that he was touched in the head. Jonah didn't care what they thought. The fewer who spoke to him, the easier it was to stay invisible. Most days began the same. He rose with the dawn, lit the stove, and carried water from the creek. He mended fences, chopped firewood, and rode his horse out across the ridges to check the land he'd claimed. No cattle, no family, no neighbors, just silence. At night, he sat by the fire, sharpening his knife or reading an old Bible, though his faith had long since rusted. Sometimes, when the wind howled down from the mountains, memories broke through his defenses. He would see Clara's face, his wife, laughing as she stirred a pot over the fire, their baby in her arms. He would remember the day he buried them both in a shallow grave beside the cottonwoods, the earth still frozen from winter. And he would remember the bottle he drained that night, and the pistol he almost put to his head. Only almost. The war had taught him how to endure, even when endurance felt like punishment. Years passed that way, each day indistinguishable from the last. Jonah came to think of himself as a ghost, someone who had already died, but hadn't stopped walking yet. He had no quarrel with anyone, and he wanted none. His gun, once quick as lightning, hung rusted in its holster. His hands, scarred and steady, turned only to work, never to violence. Dust Creek changed around him, though he paid little mind. Carver had become sheriff, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. The saloon filled with rough drifters who seemed to answer more to Carver than to the law. Taxes rose, roads crumbled, and honest men muttered but did nothing. Jonah saw it all when he passed through town, but he had learned the cost of meddling in other people's fights. He wanted no part of it. One autumn evening, he sat on the porch of his cabin, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. The sun bled red into the horizon, staining the mesas like fire. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain. He felt, as he often did, that the world was turning without him, leaving him rooted in place like an old tree. That was fine. He had no need to move with it. But beneath that stillness, a restlessness simmered. He could not name it, nor did he try. Perhaps it was the loneliness pressing in after so many years. Perhaps it was the unspoken truth that no man, however hardened, could live forever without a purpose. Jonah had trained himself to ignore the ache, the hunger for something beyond silence. Yet it lingered, like a coal that refused to die out. The people of Dust Creek had stopped expecting anything of him. A hermit, they called him. A relic. Some said he was waiting to die, others that he already had. Jonah let them talk. It was easier that way. No ties, no expectations, no disappointments. On that same night, as the shadows lengthened and coyotes began their mournful cries, Jonah thought again of leaving. He had a map, folded and worn, that showed a trail westward toward Nevada. Land there was wild and empty, more empty even than Dust Creek. He could disappear entirely, vanish into mountains where no one would follow. The thought tempted him as it always did, but he never acted on it. Something tethered him to this broken town, though he did not know what. Until the night Sarah Miller ran out of the rocks with a notebook in her hands and terror in her voice, Jonah Briggs believed he had buried himself deep enough that the world would never find him again. The desert had a way of swallowing sound, but not tonight. The echoes of pursuit still carried faintly through the rocks. The hard laughter of men who knew they were hunters and the ragged shouts of a sheriff whose voice carried authority only because it was backed by violence. Jonah Briggs had heard those sounds often enough in his younger days. They never meant anything good. He sat stiff in the saddle, reins loose in his left hand, his horse snorting uneasily as if it too caught the scent of danger. Ahead of him, the girl stumbled out from the shadows of the trail. The moon lit her face just enough for him to see the terror carved into her features. She was little more than a child, perhaps 16, maybe 17, her hair tangled and wild, her dress ripped in a dozen places. In her arms, pressed tight against her chest along with the battered leather notebook, she cradled something small and alive. A kitten, its white paws clutching at the fabric as if it too sensed the peril that hung in the air. Jonah pulled his horse to a halt. He said nothing, only studied her with the wary eyes of a man who had long ago stopped letting strangers into his world. The girl staggered forward. Her voice broke as she spoke. He killed his deputy, she stammered, words tumbling over one another. I saw it in the cave. They're coming for me. Please. Her breath hitched, and her knees buckled. She clutched the notebook harder, as if it were a shield. Jonah swung down from the saddle before he even realized what he was doing. Instinct had moved him, the old soldier's reflex to help the wounded, the hunted. He caught her by the arm just as she would have collapsed into the dirt. She weighed nothing, skin and bones under his calloused hand. The kitten mewed pitifully between them. For a long moment Jonah said nothing. His mind argued with itself. This was none of his concern. He had lived too long by the rule of distance. Do not get involved, do not invite trouble. The girl's eyes, wide and glistening in the moonlight, pierced that wall like a knife. What's in the book? His voice was low, gravelly from disuse. Sarah swallowed hard, fighting to steady her breath. Numbers, she whispered. Names. Money that was stolen from the people from the town. I found it in a cave. There was a badge too, Deputy Collins. He wrote it down, all of it. Sheriff Carver killed him for it. I heard the shot. He doesn't know I was there. Her words tumbled out in fragments, but Jonah pieced them together. He had known Deputy Collins, a decent man, one of the few in Dust Creek who still carried himself with quiet integrity. If Carver had truly killed him, then the rot in Dust Creek ran deeper than Jonah had guessed. Behind them, the distant voices drew nearer. Jonah glanced over his shoulder, the moon painting the ridgeline in silver and shadow. They didn't have much time. He looked back at the girl. She was trembling so hard he could feel it through her arm. The kitten shifted, curling against her as if to comfort her. Jonah had spent years pushing the world away, convincing himself that no one else's fight was his. But here it was, standing in front of him, small and desperate, begging without pride. Name? He asked. Sarah. Sarah Miller. The name meant little to him. Probably some farm girl, maybe an orphan. Dust Creek was full of them. But there was a steadiness in her eyes beneath the fear, a spark that told him she had not broken yet. Jonah released a slow breath, like a man exhaling the last of his excuses. "All right," he said finally. "Up you go." He lifted her with surprising gentleness and set her on his horse. The animal tossed its head but stood firm as Sarah clung to the saddle horn, still clutching both kitten and notebook. Jonah tightened the cinch on the saddle and rested his hand briefly on the girl's shoulder. "You stay quiet," he told her. "And you hold on. I'll get you to someone I trust." Her eyes widened. "You believe me?" Jonah met her gaze evenly. "I don't reckon you'd be running like the devil himself was after you if you were lying." The sound of hooves clattered on the rocks behind them, closer now, maybe less than a quarter mile. Jonah turned, his body stiffening. Carver and his men would be here any minute. He swung into the saddle behind Sarah, his presence towering over her slight frame. The girl's kitten squirmed nervously, then settled into her lap with a soft purr. Jonah nudged the horse forward at a careful pace, choosing a narrow trail that cut into the hills rather than fleeing blindly across the flats. As they rode, Sarah whispered again, voice trembling with urgency. "He won't stop, mister. Sheriff Carver, he'll kill me same as he killed Collins. I know too much. He's stolen more than anyone realizes. Money that was supposed to go to the bridge, the school, the church. It's all written here." She tapped the notebook, clutching it like a lifeline. "If people knew." "Shoo!" Jonah raised a hand, silencing her. His eyes were scanning the ridgeline. Every instinct in him was awake now, the old instincts he had tried to bury under years of silence. He could feel the weight of the pistol at his side, heavier than it had been in years. He had sworn never to use it again unless there was no other choice. The voices behind them grew louder, echoing across the ravine. A gunshot cracked the night, fired into the air, Carver's signal to his men. Jonah slowed the horse, pulling it to a stop. His jaw tightened as he looked down the trail. In the moonlight, Sheriff Wade Carver rode into view, broad-shouldered, his face ruddy from whiskey. His grin stretched wide as though this were all a game. Four riders flanked him, rifles glinting in the silver light. "Well now," Carver drawled, his voice carrying easy across the distance. "If it ain't old Jonah Briggs, come down from his hole in the hills. Didn't know you'd taken to rescuing strays." Sarah stiffened in the saddle, shrinking closer against Jonah's chest. Carver's eyes caught the glimmer of the notebook in her hands, and his grin widened. Jonah said nothing. His right hand hovered near his holster. The silence stretched taut as a wire. For the first time in years, Jonah Briggs felt the old heat in his blood, the pulse of a man who had once stood unflinching on battlefields. He nudged Sarah gently, leaning close enough for only her to hear. "Stay still," he murmured. "Whatever happens next, you hold tight." From that moment on, Jonah knew there was no turning back. The desert was silent except for the restless breathing of horses and the faint rattle of spurs. Moonlight silvered the rocks, cutting sharp edges into the landscape. Jonah Briggs sat tall in the saddle. The girl pressed close in front of him, the leather notebook clutched to her chest like a relic. Sheriff Wade Carver and his riders blocked the trail, grins wide, rifles angled casually across their saddles. The hunters had cornered their prey. For years Jonah had kept himself apart from all of this, the politics, the greed, the rot that festered in Dust Creek. He had built his solitude like a wall, plank by plank, silence by silence. But now the wall was crumbling. A girl's sobs pressed against his chest, and Carver's smug grin pressed against every nerve he still had left. "Evenin', Briggs," Carver drawled, voice slick as oil. "Didn't think you cared about anyone but yourself. Funny seein' you play the hero." His eyes flicked to Sarah. "That's my runaway, sittin' where she don't belong. Hand her over, and I'll forget we saw you." Jonah's jaw tightened. His hand hovered just above the worn grip of his pistol, the leather of the holster creaking softly with each breath. He hadn't drawn in years, not since he had promised himself never to kill again. But he felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him now, heavy as the war had once been. Sarah turned her face upward, whispering so softly he barely heard. "Don't let him take me." That was it. The words struck something inside Jonah that he thought long dead. Once he had failed to protect those he loved. Once he had buried a wife and child under the cottonwoods, powerless to stop death from stealing them. This time he would not fail. Jonah nudged his horse forward, placing himself squarely between Carver and the girl. The air grew taut, every rider watching, waiting for the draw they half expected, half dreaded. Jonah's voice was low but carried clean across the trail. "She stays with me." A ripple of surprise crossed Carver's face before he laughed, sharp and mocking. "Stays with you? Briggs, you ain't got the stomach for this fight. You've been hidin' in that shack of yours so long folks forgot you were ever a man. You really want to dig up that old gun of yours and die in the dirt tonight?" Jonah didn't move. His silence was answer enough. Carver's smile thinned. "That book she's holdin' worthless scribbles. No one's gonna believe a half-crazed girl with stories about tax money and ghosts of deputies. You bring it back to me, and maybe I'll let you both walk." Sarah's arms tightened around the notebook. Jonah laid a steady hand on hers, then looked Carver squarely in the eye. "Not tonight." The sheriff's grin faltered, the glint in his eyes turning hard. He leaned forward in his saddle, voice dropping low and venomous. "You know what happens to folks who stand in my way." Jonah's hand dropped fully to the pistol grip. The motion was deliberate, unmistakable. The riders behind Carver straightened in their saddles, hands twitching toward rifles, but none dared draw first. Every man there had heard the stories. Stories of a soldier turned drifter, a man once faster with a gun than any they'd seen. They didn't know how much truth lived in those stories, but the way Jonah's hand rested steady on the Colt told them enough. For the first time in years, Jonah felt alive. Not in peace, but in defiance. The air seemed sharper, the ground firmer beneath him. He had made his choice. Whatever came, he would not step aside. Carver read it in his eyes. The sheriff spat in the dust. "Fine," he growled. "You want the girl? Then you just bought yourself her fight. And when the sun comes up, Briggs, you'll wish you'd stayed in your hole." He wheeled his horse abruptly, signaling his men. The riders turned, muttering, eyes casting wary glances at Jonah as they disappeared back down the trail. The echo of hooves faded, leaving only the wind whispering through the rocks. Sarah let out a breath she'd been holding, shoulders shaking with relief. Jonah kept his hand on the pistol grip long after the last hoofbeat faded, only relaxing when the silence was whole again. He looked down at the girl. Her face was pale but set with determination. She held the notebook tighter than ever, the kitten pressed between them like a warm heartbeat. "Where we goin'?" she asked in a small voice. Jonah studied the horizon, the distant lights of Dust Creek flickering faintly. "Somewhere safe," he said. His voice carried a finality that surprised even him. "I know a man or two still worth their salt. Folks Carver hasn't bought." He guided the horse toward the canyon's edge, picking a trail that wound westward. Sarah leaned against him, exhausted, her breathing slowly steadying. For the first time in years, Jonah felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders again. Not the burden of grief, but the purpose of protection. As the night stretched on, he rode with her through the rugged country, always listening for the echo of riders behind them. He knew Carver would not give up. The sheriff would gather more men, twist the law to his will, and come for them with fire if need be. Jonah had declared war tonight, war against the corruption that had rotted Dust Creek for too long. He thought of Clara and the boy he had lost, of the grave beneath the cottonwoods. His chest ached with memory, but this time the ache was tempered with resolve. Maybe fate had given him another chance, not to erase his past, but to fight for someone else's future. The moon dipped low, shadows stretching long across the desert. Jonah's horse carried them steady, each hoofbeat a drum of commitment. There was no turning back now. By the time the first light of dawn burned across the mesas, Dust Creek was already stirring. Wagons rattled along the muddy main street, Shopkeepers lifted creaking shutters, and the saloon doors swung with the early shuffle of men who had never gone to bed. It looked like any other morning in a dying frontier town, but under its surface something sharp and restless was shifting. Sheriff Wade Carver had returned in a foul temper. He strode into the saloon before the sun had cleared the horizon, boots caked with dust, his hat pulled low to hide his scowl. His men followed close behind, glancing nervously at one another. They had seen Jonah Briggs last night, seen the steel in his eyes, the gun hand that hadn't lost its calm weight. None of them wanted to cross that line. Carver slammed a bottle on the bar. Pouring himself a drink he didn't bother to sip. "She's got the book," he muttered. "The numbers, the names. Collins wrote it all down before I caught him. Now that brat's running with Briggs, and if they get it into the wrong hands." He cut himself off with a snarl. A silence fell over the saloon. Men who usually laughed at his jokes, who usually scrambled to fetch his whiskey or light his cigar, kept their heads down. The sheriff was dangerous when cornered. Carver leaned on the bar, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. His grin returned, but it was thin, tight. "Doesn't matter. Nobody's gonna believe her word against mine. What's she got? A dead man's scribbles? The whole town knows Collins drank too much, heard voices that weren't there. I'll paint her the same. Crazy girl tellin' tales." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The notebook was real, and if Briggs showed it to the wrong people, federal people, it would unravel everything Carver had built. For years he had skimmed taxes, pocketed land grants, and sold cattle meant for the army. He had bought silence with whiskey and favors, with threats and sometimes bullets. But paper left a trail and numbers didn't lie. He turned to his men, eyes cold. "Round up who we can trust. Not just the drunks, men who'll fight. We're gonna flush Briggs out of whatever hole he's hiding in and burn it to the ground if we have to." The order spread like wildfire. By mid-morning, a quiet storm brewed in Dust Creek. Carver's allies, ranchers who owed him favors, gamblers whose debts he held, gunmen hungry for coin, began gathering in back rooms and barns. The sheriff's laughter rang out in the street, loud and false, as he promised easy money and easy justice. Jonah and Sarah were miles away by then, riding through canyons where the sun hadn't yet reached. They stopped only when Sarah's strength gave out. Jonah built a small fire in the lee of a boulder, his movements steady, controlled. The girl sat close, feeding crumbs of biscuit to the kitten, her eyes still red but no longer wild with panic. Jonah studied the notebook by the flicker of firelight. The leather was worn, the pages cramped with Collins's careful hand. Each entry was a ledger of theft. Taxes collected, amounts pocketed, names of men who had taken their cut. Bridges unfunded, schools left to rot, families cheated of land that was theirs by law. Jonah felt his jaw tighten as he read. Collins had been thorough. The man had known he was in danger, and still he had written everything down, hoping someone might carry it forward if he fell. Sarah's voice broke the silence. "He was kind to me, Deputy Collins. He used to bring milk for the kitten when no one else cared. That's how I found the cave. I followed him one night. He was hiding the book there. Then I heard Carver come." Her voice faltered, eyes brimming again. "I thought if I kept it safe, maybe it would matter. Maybe someone would care." Jonah closed the notebook carefully and handed it back to her. "It matters," he said. His voice was firm, without hesitation. "You did right." She looked at him as if she weren't sure whether to believe. Jonah kept his gaze steady. He had lived too long in shadows, letting the world rot around him, telling himself it wasn't his fight. But this was different. A girl had risked everything to carry the truth. That left him no excuse. By the second night, riders had begun to comb the countryside. Fires dotted the ridges as Carver's men searched every ravine and canyon. Farmers whispered of seeing posses ride past their gates, armed to the teeth. Dust Creek was uneasy, as if it held its breath. Carver spread his story fast. A runaway girl, touched in the head, making wild claims. He laughed in the saloon, telling anyone who'd listen that Jonah Briggs was just a hermit chasing ghosts, that the two of them were liars and thieves. He told it so often he almost believed it himself. Almost. But when word came that Jonah had shown the notebook to two old veterans in the hills, men respected even by Carver's enemies, the laughter stopped. If more people saw those pages, Carver's empire would collapse. The sheriff gathered his posse in the square, his voice thundering. "We ain't chasin' one little girl anymore. We're fastened traitors. Briggs is stirring up lies to turn this town against itself. We'll smoke him out, and we'll burn every scrap of paper he's got." Cheers rose from the drunken crowd, but not everyone joined in. Some men exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers began to move through Dust Creek. Questions about Collins's death, about the missing money. Doubt was a dangerous thing, and Carver could feel it spreading. On the third night, Jonah led Sarah to an abandoned miner's shack tucked deep in the canyon. The girl was exhausted, her face pale, but she refused to let go of the notebook. Jonah watched her sleep, the kitten curled against her cheek, and knew the storm was close. He stood outside beneath the stars, the cold air sharp in his lungs. For the first time in years, his hand rested easy on the pistol at his side. He had chosen his path, and it was leading straight into the heart of Dust Creek. Tomorrow he would ride there. Tomorrow the truth would have its chance. But tonight, he listened to the far-off sound of riders gathering. Their voices carried on the wind like thunder. Sheriff Carver was coming, and he was bringing the weight of a corrupt town with him. The threat had grown, and there would be no peace until it broke. By the time Jonah Briggs rode back into Dust Creek, the town was already braced for something. The air itself seemed to quiver. Folks who normally drifted about their chores now stood in clusters, whispering on porches, watching the street as though they expected it to erupt. Jonah rode steady, Sarah seated before him, the notebook pressed tight to her chest. The kitten peeked from the fold of her shawl, eyes wide. Jonah's face was cut from stone, his hand resting close to his Colt but not yet drawing. He had sent word ahead, silent riders carrying messages through the hills to men he trusted, and beyond them, to the federal agents already sniffing around rumors of embezzlement in frontier towns. By tonight, Dust Creek would no longer belong to Wade Carver. The square filled as the riders approached. Carver himself waited at the center, his broad frame draped in his long coat, his hat low. Behind him stood 24 armed men, rifles gleaming in the midday sun. His grin spread wide as Jonah reined in, the horses' hooves clattering against the boards of the street. Well, Carver drawled, loud enough for every ear. "If it ain't the hermit come crawlin' down with his prize. Look at you, Briggs, playin' knight in Shernene armor." His gaze snapped to Sarah. "And you, little liar, tellin' tales no one asked to hear. You think anyone's gonna believe you?" He raised his voice so the crowd could hear, laughter booming. "A cave full of books and ghosts? Money hidin' in shadows? Hell, if we're talking bedtime stories, maybe there's gold buried under the church too." The crowd chuckled uneasily, though no one laughed as loud as Carver. The girl trembled against Jonah's chest, but Jonah didn't flinch. He reached down, took the notebook from Sarah's hands, and held it high for all to see. His voice carried low but sharp, every word slicing the silence. "It ain't stories, it's truth. Deputy Collins wrote every theft, every stolen coin, every name that fed from this town's purse." The murmur in the crowd swelled. Carver's grin froze, the laughter dying in his throat. Jonah flipped open the book, showing pages scrawled with figures. "This here's what your sheriff's been doing with your taxes. Money for bridges, schools, even for your own land titles. Gone." Carver's face darkened, jaw tight. "Enough!" he barked. He swung suddenly, seizing Sarah by the arm and yanking her from the saddle. She cried out, the kitten tumbling from her grasp. It hit the ground, hissed, and darted between horses. Carver pressed his revolver against Sarah's temple, dragging her close. "She's nothing but a liar," he roared, spit flying. "And this man's a fool. You believe them, you're tunnin' on your own law." The square erupted in shouts. Women gasped, men cursed, Rifles were raised but no one fired. Jonah sat rigid in the saddle, his hand now on his pistol, eyes locked on Carver. Then it happened. The kitten, startled by the commotion, leapt against Carver's horse's flank. The animal reared with a terrified scream, throwing Carver off balance. He stumbled, dragging Sarah down with him, his revolver firing wildly into the dirt. The crowd surged forward, and in that instant, federal agents who had been waiting on the edge of town stormed into the square, weapons drawn. "Sheriff Wade Carver," one of them shouted, a badge glinting bright. "You're under arrest for theft from the United States Treasury and for the murder of Deputy Collins." Carver's face twisted. A man cornered. He tried to drag Sarah up again, but townsfolk surged forward, blocking him, their fear finally breaking into fury. Men who had lost land, women who had gone without schools for their children, laborers who had worked roads that never got built. All shouting, pressing closer. Carver raised his gun again, but Jonah was faster. The Colt was out, steady, its barrel aimed square at Carver's chest. Jonah's voice cut through the chaos, calm as steel. "It's over." For a long second, Carver's hand shook, his breath ragged. Then the revolver slipped from his fingers, clattering to the dirt. The agents closed in, shackles flashing in the sun. The sheriff who had ruled Dust Creek with fear and whiskey was dragged to his knees, cursing until the gag silenced him. The truth spilled quick after that. The agents confirmed the cave, found the stolen treasury funds stacked in crates, exact amounts matching Collins's ledger. Witnesses stepped forward. Men who had long feared to speak, now emboldened. Each word nailed Carver's coffin tighter. The square quieted slowly, the crowd's anger replaced by stunned relief. For the first time in years, Dust Creek had seen power change not by fear, but by truth. Jonah sat motionless, his pistol holstered once more. Sarah was pulled gently into the arms of townsfolk, safe at last. She clutched the kitten when it was handed back, her small frame trembling with sobs. Not of fear this time, but of release. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the square. Carver was hauled away under heavy guard, his empire crumbling into dust. Dust Creek stood silent, watching, as though unsure how to breathe without his shadow looming over them. And Jonah Briggs, who had sworn never to stand for another fight, had delivered them into light. The sun sank low over Dust Creek, painting the buildings with a soft gold that softened even the harshest lines of the town. Streets that had been tense and wary for weeks were now calm, though still crowded with whispers and the occasional cautious glance at one another. The arrest of Sheriff Wade Carver had left a vacuum, but the people felt lighter, freer, than they had in decades. Sarah Miller was returned to her aunt's home, tucked safely behind the sturdy walls of the farmhouse. She carried the kitten close, whispering apologies for the tiny creature's misadventures. The house smelled of fresh bread and clean linens, and for the first time since fleeing the cave, she felt a sense of belonging. Her aunt fussed over her, checking cuts and scrapes, brushing dirt from her hair. Words of reprimand mixed with relief, but there were tears behind the stern voice, tears Sarah recognized as joy. Jonah Briggs lingered outside the house, leaning against his horse, the setting sun glinting off the worn metal of his colt. He had come to bid farewell, knowing that a hermit's life would call him back to solitude. Yet, when he saw Sarah smile at him, cheeks flushed and eyes bright despite everything, something in him stirred. A warmth he hadn't felt in years, perhaps since Clara. You saved me," Sarah said softly, the words almost catching in her throat. Her voice carried no accusation, no plea, only gratitude. She knelt down, setting the kitten gently on the porch, letting it explore the sunlight-dappled boards. It looked up at Jonah and mewed, tiny eyes full of trust. Jonah gave a faint smile, the first in a long time, and crouched to scratch behind the kitten's ears. "Seems your little friend did as much Leodin as you did," he said, voice low, almost playful. The kitten responded with a soft purr, curling closer. Sarah laughed quietly, a sound that seemed fragile but determined, like the first wind through a canyon in spring. She handed him the leather notebook, worn and tattered, the pages still filled with Collins's meticulous writing. "It's done now," she said. "The town knows. The money's back, the people are safe." Jonah took the book, setting it on a nearby table. "It's more than done. You made sure of that. The truth doesn't get buried again. Thanks to you." His voice carried a note of admiration he didn't voice lightly. He had spent so long avoiding the world, pretending he didn't care, but now he saw that even a small hand could tip the scales toward justice. Over the next weeks, Dust Creek began to change. Townsfolk, once cowed, began repairing the roads, raising funds for the school, even organizing a committee to restore the bridge that had fallen to neglect. The presence of federal agents had scared some, but it had also inspired courage. Carver's men had been dealt with, some jailed, others fleeing the territory entirely, and the shadow that had loomed over the town for so long lifted incrementally with each act of rebuilding. Jonah returned to his cabin beyond the hills, but it was different now. Where once it had been a fortress of solitude, it was slowly becoming a home again. He fixed the roof completely, patched the walls, and even swept the porch. A lamp, long unused, burned brightly on the table inside, casting soft amber light across the room. He had kept the pistol close, but it remained untouched. This time, his vigilance was for the land he cared for and the small, quiet life he could rebuild, not for vengeance. Occasionally, Sarah would come to visit, always with the kitten tucked in her arms. They would sit on the porch together, talking about the town, the school, and the bridge. Jonah listened, offering counsel when asked, but mostly he simply watched her grow, seeing in her the same courage and determination that had propelled him back into the world when he thought himself lost. The townsfolk noticed Jonah more now, too. No longer just the hermit in the hills, he became a quiet presence, a figure of integrity who had acted when no one else would. People respected the boundary he maintained, but they also knew that if a wrong needed righting, he would step forward again. And in that quiet, understated way, the town felt safer. One evening, Jonah sat on the porch, the lamp lit, the notebook resting unopened beside him. The wind carried the smell of sage and warm earth from the hills. The sky, vast and unbroken, was brushed with streaks of purple and gold. Jonah breathed it in, a long, steady inhale that seemed to wash away the ghosts that had haunted him for decades. He thought of Collins, of the girl he had protected, of the little kitten whose unexpected movements had altered the course of justice. He thought of Dust Creek, a town bruised but resilient. For the first time in his adult life, Jonah felt a measure of peace. Not perfect peace. Life never granted perfection, but enough to make the nights quieter, the days sharper, and the heart lighter. The kitten crawled onto his lap, warm and soft. Jonah stroked it absent-mindedly, and Sarah's laughter carried faintly from the road as she walked back to town. He looked out over the horizon and allowed himself a small smile. The world had not been perfected, the past had not been erased, but truth had survived. And in Dust Creek, for the first time in many years, hope had found a foothold. The lamp flickered gently, shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant clatter of horses and the faint murmur of townsfolk. Jonah Briggs, once a hermit, once a man who had hidden from the world, sat quietly in the glow of the lamp. He had fought, he had stood, he had chosen. And for tonight, that was enough. The world outside was messy, corrupt, and uncertain. But inside that small cabin, Jonah, Sarah, and the kitten, small arbiters of truth in a rough land, found a stillness that was almost sacred. The notebook remained, the story preserved, the town slowly righting itself. And for the first time in decades, Jonah felt that the world, though still flawed, was a little cleaner. He leaned back, letting the quiet settle over him. In Dust Creek, under the sweep of endless sky, with justice done and the sun dipping low, the lamp glowed, and the story finally could rest.